right. Well, good evening. Thank you so much for joining us here at Crime Crunchies. At Crime Crunchies, we don't just take a bite out of crime, we crunch it. And I am your host, Courtney C. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We are a new channel, and I really appreciate if you would take the time to subscribe. It is completely free. It will help us to get in the algorithm and for YouTube to start sharing our video. Please subscribe, like, share, and comment. Again, all helps to get us into the YouTube algorithm. So tonight I thought I would talk a little bit about Bryan Kohberger and really just him as a person and what it must have been like to parent somebody like Bryan Kohberger with all of his different issues. And, people have actually described him as kind of like a robot. So I wanted to kind of take a deeper dive into what it was like when he was growing up, what his family has had to deal with him, and some of the latest issues surrounding the guilty plea that he just pled. So let's dive in right now. Let's talk a little bit about Bryan Kohberger. So Bryan Christopher Kohberger was born on November 21st, 1994 in Albrightsville, Pennsylvania. It's a very small town in Monroe County. His parents, Michael, was a school district maintenance worker, which is, I don't think it's kind of like a janitor, but it could have been anything, working to repair things at school. So definitely a blue collar job. And his mother, Marianne, was a paraprofessional / substitute teacher. So in his childhood, they faced financial struggles, including bankruptcy filings in 1995 and 2010. He grew up with two older sisters, Amanda, who is a school counselor, and Melissa, an associate counselor, continuing a family tradition of work in education or mental health. So Bryan Kohberger attended Pleasant Valley High School in Broadheadsville, Pennsylvania. Bryan struggled with being overweight and faced bullying from peers, particularly during middle school and early high school. Classmates have recalled that by his senior year, after a dramatic weight loss, he morphed into a more assertive and some said aggressive teenager. A friend once noted that he became rail thin and began boxing, possibly to cope or to assert control physically. Another friend, Dominique Clark, saw his weight loss as obsessive and associated it with a more withdrawn, isolated behavior. These years were formative. Bryan transitioned from target to instigator. Reports mention episodes where he would grab, headlock, or gaslight peers, signaling a complex psychological shift. High school also marked the start of a heroin addiction, evolving from earlier marijuana use. One friend described the change: he started spending time with another group. I feel he was looking for validation, and that's why he fell into that crowd. By senior year, after losing weight, Bryan became more secretive and self-destructive, later entering recovery around 2017. After high school in 2013, Bryan briefly attended Monroe Career and Technical Institute, pursuing law enforcement before switching to HVAC and then dropping out to complete his diploma via online courses. He later completed an associate degree in psychology from Northampton Community College in 2018, a bachelor's degree at DeSales University in 2020, and a master's in criminal justice from DeSales College in June of 2022. During this time, he also worked as a part-time security officer for his high school district, mirroring his father's employment. A brief legal issue occurred in 2014 when he allegedly sold a stolen iPhone. Now, I'm going to talk a little bit more about this iPhone later on when I'm looking at kind of how his father dealt with him and some of his incidents and his father's potential guilt over how his son turned out. So Bryan's high school peers described him as intelligent, yet socially awkward. One friend said he was really, really intelligent, awkward, and intelligent. Another said he always wanted to fight somebody. We started cutting him off. He was 100% a different person. Bryan was opinionated, eager to show off his knowledge, and sometimes dismissive toward LGBTQ plus individuals and women. His intensity and need for validation were recurring traits. Classmates recall him speaking in overly academic tones. So, we've heard a lot of things about him being an incel, which is an involuntary celibate. Looking down on women, having a misogynistic attitude, and it definitely was not just toward women, but other, groups in the community. Bryan had visual snow syndrome, a neurological condition causing visual static, often accompanied by tinnitus, which is ringing in the ears, and migraines. He discussed these symptoms openly during college. According to Wikipedia, he has self-reported diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder and OCD. So self-reported, I don't know if he's just leaning on that, but I'll talk a little bit more about autism and my background with autism and people I've dealt with. And again, these things will only be my opinion, but definitely wanted to share, things that I've seen when it comes to Bryan Kohberger and his supposed autism spectrum disorder. So driven by his struggles and interests, Bryan pursued criminology to better understand criminal minds, people, and himself. During his master's degree at DeSales, he studied under forensic psychologist Katherine Ramsland, a noted expert in homicide psychology. In August 2022, he began a PhD in criminal justice at Washington State University in Pullman, Washington, near Moscow, Idaho. I believe it's about 9 miles away, about 15 minutes away from Moscow, where he was going to school for his PhD. Serving as a teaching assistant, he even applied for an internship with Pullman Police Department, expressing plans to refine how police use tech and data in investigations. I definitely do believe that he was specifically using, the tech, going to school under Katherine Ramsland, who again is a noted expert in homicide psychology. I almost want to think that he was trying to find himself a little bit in this, in the studies that he was doing, because he even had referred to himself as unfeeling, unable to feel, frozen. And so I have to wonder if he was studying this type of behavioral psychology to maybe tap into himself a little bit, because he couldn't feel. And a lot of people said that he spoke in a robotic tone. People have mentioned that during his plea hearing that he definitely sounded robotic, and I have to agree with that. So some of the warning signs: around late 2022, colleagues at Washington State University reportedly grew concerned about his behavior toward female students. This was when he was a teacher's assistant. In school, he would actually grade the papers, and it's reported that he was definitely harder and kind of put down some of the female students. One grad student noted he was stressed, exhausted, habitually late, and always with coffee. He also appeared relentless in asserting his intelligence. These concerns led to his termination as a teaching assistant and funding loss in December 19th of 2022. A lot of these female assistants were probably turning him in, saying that he was demeaning. He would unfairly grade their papers, make comments. And I think a lot of this has to do with, his own disgust in himself and the incel mindset of not being able to be with women, get with women, socialize with women. And I think it really tore him down. So Bryan maintained an online presence, posting in June 2022 under his name about research into emotions and decision-making in crime. He was reportedly fascinated with infamous serial killers like Ted Bundy and Elliot Rodgers, sometimes referencing Papa Roger in online forums. This obsession linked to heavier concerns, including misogynistic online activity. And if you have not already checked out, Amazon Prime has a brand new documentary. I think there's 4 episodes where there is a Facebook group in Idaho, and the administrators of this Facebook group were interviewed by Amazon Prime, and they specifically mentioned this Papa Roger, who would post a lot of the same questions, almost exactly worded the same, that Bryan Kohberger had in his questionnaire that he had put out to people to answer. Like, when you are doing a crime, what are you thinking and feeling? Did you, what did you do upon leaving the crime scene? Did you clean up? What were you feeling when you left the crime scene? Is there anything that you took? Did you leave a knife sheath? And I mean, it's very specific, because at the time this knife sheath was mentioned in this Facebook group, the knife sheath had not been made public, that they had found this in the bed at the crime scene, and that it had been left behind by the killer, and the snap on the sheath was actually what they were able to get the trace DNA from. So it was very interesting that this Papa Roger was, it was pretty obvious it was Bryan Kohberger, and the people that were administrating the Facebook page had to think that this possibly was the killer, and that he was actually in this community group watching people, looking for their expressions. The picture that Bryan Kohberger took after the morning after the murders, he is doing the thumbs up in the shower. I suspect this was probably the first time he actually felt alive and actually felt something. And I strongly believe that if he had not been caught, if he had not messed up and left that knife sheath behind, he probably would have done this again. I really feel like he never felt more alive, and that all of his planning and recon and practice drive-bys had all just been leading up to him trying to feel something when he couldn't feel before. So moving to Pullman and the Washington State University in August 2022 placed Bryan, like I said before, about 8 miles of the crime scene in Moscow, Idaho, where 4 students were unalived on November 13, 2022. He had just completed his first semester before the murders. Surveillance, DNA, phone data, and forensic genealogy tie him to the scene, leading to his arrest on December 30th, 2022 at his parents' home in Pennsylvania. Some Reddit users who knew him provided some snapshots. So this is a quote from some people who had known him before. So, quote, "At the start of senior year, Kohberger was thinner than a rail and turned aggressive. He'd also picked up boxing classes, which I mentioned before. He was socially awkward and openly hostile toward women. In his mind, he had worked so hard, but nothing ever seemed to be enough. No girlfriend, no companionship." And again, with him bragging about his intelligence, he probably thought that that was attractive and that a woman would want to be with him because he's so intelligent. Another offered psychological insight, portraying him as paranoid, vengeful, and grievance-focused. So, quote, "He lived a restricted and mechanical life. He had a temper with a paranoid quality. He could hold a grudge. It was not impulsive anger." All right. So again, we've got early bullying, obesity, intense weight loss, a shift from victim to aggressor in adolescence, substance addiction, including heroin, followed by recovering, academic brilliance in psychology and criminal justice, working as a school security guard and pursuing policing roles, which he was never hired to be a police officer, which he really wanted to do. He had a thirst for understanding crime, possibly driven by personal insecurity, social isolation, misogyny, and online persona fixations, graduate level immersion in criminology, followed by behavioral red flags, a geographic and operational proximity to a major crime scene. So together, these facets paint a portrait of a deeply troubled individual whose intellectual gifts were overshadowed by behavioral, psychological, and ideological turmoil leading up to the tragic and devastating events in November of 2022. Right. So some of the other things that I wanted to look about was, what was his relationship with his father? Because, growing up with two sisters, it's been reported that when he went home for Thanksgiving, that it was, being different news stories were coming out about the crime in Moscow, Idaho. And I think that the sisters were even wondering if it could be their brother. He had the same car. I think that they'd known that he was always a little different. But, I'm sure that it was their worst nightmare. I wanted to dive a little bit deeper into some of the things that were happening when Bryan Kohberger was living with his family and he was dealing with his drug issues. I have personal experience in, having actually a child who used, and I know that in a household, a child who is an addict, they can terrorize the family. There's a story about Bryan stealing his sister's iPhone. Whether it's true or not, I'm going to dive into a little bit about what reports are, but I would be surprised if he didn't steal more than just an iPhone. The fact that his father in these reports actually turned him in to the police is brave. I think that tough love in this situation is good. And honestly, it's too bad he wasn't arrested. Maybe the rest of the things that Bryan Kohberger did wouldn't have happened. But at the same time, you really do have to cut people off. You can't enable them. You can't coddle them. And they can terrorize the household. Absolutely. So as of now, there is no credible or verified evidence that Bryan Kohberger's father turned him into the police for stealing a cell phone or for any other crime. This claim does not appear in police reports, court filings, or reputable news sources related to the University of Idaho student killings case, in which Bryan Kohberger is the primary suspect. However, there is some information combining verified public information about Bryan Kohberger's background and his father's known involvement in the Idaho case, primarily as a supportive family member, not as somebody who turned him in. So we've already done the background of Bryan Kohberger, but let's go into the actual case and Kohberger's father and his role. Contrary to online rumors, Michael Kohberger, Bryan's father, did not turn his son into law enforcement. In fact, public records and statements indicate that Michael was largely unaware of any suspicion directed toward Bryan prior to his arrest. At the time of Bryan's arrest, his father was fully cooperative with police and appeared visibly stunned, according to reports from law enforcement. Michael Kohberger had flown to Washington State to accompany his son on a cross-country drive from Washington State University back to Pennsylvania for the holidays in December 2022. Along the way, they were stopped twice by Indiana law enforcement for minor traffic violations. In both body cam videos released publicly, both father and son appeared calm and non-confrontational. No suspicion of involvement in the murders was apparent during the stops. Michael's most notable presence in the investigation comes not as a whistleblower, but rather as a concerned and ultimately cooperative parent. He allowed police to collect DNA from the family's trash to help confirm Bryan's match to DNA left at the crime scene. Unsubstantiated rumors have circulated online claiming that Bryan Kohberger was involved in a prior incident of cell phone theft and that his father turned him into police. However, no such incident has been documented. It's likely this claim originated from speculative or fictional social media posts, conspiracy theories, or misinformation. So his father didn't turn him in. I think that I'd heard that they actually had collected the garbage, because once you throw trash into the garbage and the garbage men took the trash away, that it is then fair game for police to get without a search warrant. I heard that the police found a Q-tip with his father's DNA on it, and that is how they used genetic genealogy to trace back to Bryan Kohberger with the trace DNA on the knife sheath. So I'm not sure. It states that his father cooperated in collecting the trash. I'm not sure that is the case. So on Megyn Kelly, let me see if I can share my screen. Now, I want to share a video by Megyn Kelly because she has an author of When the Night Falls. Let me do this and share. Okay, awesome. So what this is the author of When the Night Comes Falling, Howard Blum. He was on Megyn Kelly the other night and was discussing Bryan Kohberger's relationship with his dad. So let's go ahead and tune in, and this is a few minutes long. Let's just see how this goes. We'll just take a listen.
Was getting his PhD in criminology there. And you walk us through their exchange, what was on the dad's mind, what was on the son's mind, who's now in prison awaiting trial. So talk to us a little bit about that.
Well, here is this father who makes this trip. His father is 68 years old, and he decides to go out to Washington State to then 2 days later turn around completely and drive across country with his son. He does this because he's nervous, he's anxious. He is connecting the dots in his mind. He knows his son is a disturbed young man. He knows his son has had problems. He knows his son also lives about 10 miles away where three young women and one young man were killed. And he knows his son has a white Hyundai Elantra, and that just happens to be the car, the model of the car the police are looking for. So he goes out there, not sure what he's going to find, and immediately his son is in a mood. And he's seen Bryan's moods before, and he knows to sort of go with the flow. He doesn't want to anger him. But as he spends time with Bryan, it is as if he's following footsteps. And these footsteps suddenly become bloody footsteps, and he realizes, oh my gosh, my son might very well be involved in this. And yet he also refuses to make this leap, as any parent might. They can't put this on his son. So in a way, Michael Kohberger, the father, is a victim too. He's one of the characters in this story, and I structure the book in many ways around this trip. It's sort of, like Homer's Odyssey, a long voyage, which is going to have a lot of traumatic events. And here, as the father's is coming, the fears are coming closer and closer into focus in the father's mind. The car is stopped once by a state police, actually a sheriff's deputy in Indiana, and then 9 minutes later by another sheriff's deputy, a state trooper. And the father is now realizing, perhaps this is it. Perhaps everything I was thinking about is true, and it becomes clearer and clearer. And then when the car is stopped, what's the first thing the father blurts out to the law enforcement people who are stopping the car? He talks about a shooting in Washington State University that happened earlier that day. It's what's on his mind. All this violence out in the West is coming together, and he feels something malevolent is happening, and he begins to fear as they make this cross-country journey. He begins to fear with greater certainty that his son is involved in it, and he doesn't quite know what to do.
It's something to consider that the father, too, of course, now in retrospect, when you think about it, the father, too, was suspicious of his son. We hear all these facts, knowing that Bryan Kohberger was later arrested for these crimes. And then you hear that his father had gotten him at college, was driving him back home. The cops, well, not the cops, but the FBI, this is one of the points you make in the book, was already on to him, was aware, was following. But of course the father would have suspicions. Of course the father knew about the quadruple murder, right? 10 miles from where his son was a TA and getting his PhD. He's got to know the son is weird, to just put it very mildly. He's off, very off socially. And we heard the detail prior to the book about how Bryan, the son, rerouted the trip home. They had something all set. The shortest distance between two lines is a straight one, right? And 2 points is a straight line. And how Bryan had changed it suddenly, wanted it to go a much more circuitous route home. But you really lay some details in there about how angry he was about the dad pushing back on that at all, and how the father had to handle him so gingerly. He knew he was dealing with the powder keg of a man.
It's also interesting that this was not the father's first trip out with his son. He came out when Bryan registered at the beginning of the term. He made the cross-country trip with him. Now, the father is 68 years old. The family has had financial problems. They've been bankrupt twice. They went into bankruptcy proceedings. And yet he feels he still has to go with a 28-year-old young man to be with him on this trip, even when he's registering. He doesn't want his son to be alone at the crossroads. And what does his father do when he's out there? He goes to one of Bryan's neighbors and says, my son has a hard time making friends. Can you help him out? And this neighbor invites Bryan to a pool party, which I talk about in the book. And that's really Bryan's first trip to Moscow, Idaho.
Mm-hmm. The conversation they have relating to and the revelations about Bryan Kohberger's problems in his TA position are absolutely fascinating. So it was far worse for Bryan Kohberger in the weeks leading up to the murders of these 4 University of Idaho students on November 13th, and also Bryan's return to the Poconos in early December with his dad, than I knew until I read your book. Tell us about the problems Bryan was having in the TA role, and about the fact that he revealed a lot of what he did know to the dad.
What you have to begin with, I think, to understand how traumatic this was for Bryan is where he came up from. He was an academic success story. He reinvented his life. He came from being a heroin addict at a junior college, gets into a graduate from DeSalle, and then he gets into a first-rate graduate program at a Washington State University. And he's on his way to be a doctorate. And then in the course of his first term as a teaching assistant, the students start to complain. They don't like the way he's treating them. They feel he's treating the women in a chauvinistic way. He always has to have the last say. He's marking too strictly. And the professor who's handling his course, he's working for Professor John Snyder, calls him in for a meeting. And what does Bryan do? He blows his top. He really doesn't want to discuss it, but he exacerbates matters. And the professor, who was a lawyer before coming to teach at Washington State, starts making a paper trail, sending letters to the administration that we might have a problem here, whatever. Finally, on November 2nd, just 11 days before the murders, he's given sort of an ultimatum by the authorities of Washington State. Get your act together or you're going to lose your teaching assistant job. Now, for Bryan to lose this, it's not just a job. It's the tuition that allows him to go to graduate school. It's the opportunity to reinvent his life from the hard scrabble life he was leading as a youth in the Poconos to become Professor Bryan Kohberger, become a forensic psychologist. And this was a shock to his already tentative system. I mean, Bryan is always living every day on tenterhooks, and now it becomes even worse. So while he's driving across country with his father, he begins to reveal, and this was related to me by people who had spoken with Bryan, father, to Michael Kohberger, that he's in a bit of trouble. That's how he describes it at the university. But Bryan tells his father, I'm going to have the last laugh. They can't just get rid of me. I'm going to be able to have a disciplinary hearing, and I will make my case, and I will be able to continue teaching. And I believe until the moment he's arrested, he still believes that he's going to get away with things, and he's going to be back teaching in the next semester at Washington State University. He believes that he still is the smartest person in the room, and he can outtalk these professors because in his heart he feels he's done nothing wrong. He's always right.
Okay, so let me start sharing. So this is really, really interesting. A couple things that I want to talk about. Obviously he is a narcissist. He thinks he's the smartest person in the room. Howard Blum states that himself. But with the dad dealing with Bryan Kohberger, being a parent of somebody who's an addict, it really does change their brain. And it's like, it's not your child, okay? The person that you're with who can terrorize the family, can steal from the family, can punish the family, can disrupt the family. It's his child, but it's not his child. This version of his child is like an alien. And the fear is real when you're dealing and you're sitting in a car from Washington to Pennsylvania next to somebody who is your son, but really isn't your son. And if these reports are true that Bryan mentioned to his father that he was in a bit of trouble, that probably put huge fear into his father's heart. I'm sure that his father was terrified, not knowing what that meant. And with Bryan saying, I'll have the last laugh. And again, that narcissistic, he probably honestly did think he was going to go back, because when you're talking with a narcissist, it's never their problem. It's everyone else's problem. They're perfect and you're wrong. They're right. And I fully do believe that he thought he was going to get his TA job back. But again, answering the question of him being a teaching assistant, when you're a teaching assistant, especially at the PhD level, they do cover your tuition. Okay. With Bryan's parents being more blue collar, they probably didn't have money for that type of PhD program. And if Bryan lost that TA position, and he probably was going to fail. I think this has a lot to do also with why Bryan pled guilty, which I'll talk about in a little bit. But honestly, when a child is that aggressive and that angry, the parent now that Bryan Kohberger is actually in jail, this might sound really weird, but it's so multidimensional when you have that child who has terrorized the family. The parents actually may feel a bit of relief that Bryan isn't their problem anymore. And I'm not condoning what he did. I'm not saying that the parents are relieved that he did. I'm disassociating the horrible, heinous crime that he did, unaliving the students. I'm talking about not looking at that. I'm talking about his parents may feel some relief that Bryan is not their problem anymore. And that's from a completely selfish standpoint. The father might have been relieved when Bryan Kohberger moved to Washington because he wasn't having to deal with him locally or live with him in the house. The sisters were probably relieved when he left because he wasn't terrorizing them or stealing them. And, not just from stealing and the anger. When you've got somebody who has an opiate addiction like heroin, they could be sitting around the house. They could be nodding off. It's not pleasant. If they don't have their fix, they go crazy. I think that there are a lot of other issues going on with him. While he might think he has autism or Asperger's, most of the autistic, at least children that I've dealt with, and this is just commentary, this is just my opinion, most people with autism, they're like really loving. They're really, just the best people ever. They're sweet. They might be neurodivergent, but at the same time, they're just awesome people to be around. And so while Bryan might have thought he had autism or Asperger's, probably more psychosis than anything else. And again, obviously, I'm not a psychiatrist. I have looked into him. I have not looked into him at all. I just have to think that there's other mental issues that he has, in addition to narcissism, sociopath, not being able to get along with people. I think that it's not just autism. I definitely think the robotic nature, not being able to sense social cues, going out on a date and following up and telling the female he went on the date with that she has great birthing hips, just not normal. This guy was probably a screwball his whole life. And again, I have to imagine that his parents, knowing that he's in jail, he can't do any more harm, they are probably somewhat relieved on just that one aspect, that they don't have to worry about cleaning up a mess from him. They don't have to deal with him screwing up and the stress of what else he could do. Again, completely removing the horrible things. I'm sure that the parents are horrified, especially with him pleading guilty. I'm sure that the mother hung and clung to the hope that he had not done these things. But I mean, it was chilling watching him plead guilty and say, answering those robotic answers to the judge when they were going through all the charges and saying, yes, yes, yes. The way that he stood up in front of the judge, it was like his big moment. I think that he definitely was looking for infamy. He was the best, the brightest, the smartest. And, I think he probably thought he was doing the perfect crime and was not going to get caught, but he did. And, I can't really say I was totally surprised that he took the plea deal, because think about it. They were going into people that Bryan had grown up with. These are probably unhappy memories, people who bullied him, where he wasn't the best. And Bryan in his mind thinking, I'm so awesome. I'm so smart. I can't believe people didn't want me. Why would Bryan want to sit through a trial where they were going to layer by layer peel back all of the bad things about Bryan? He wasn't going to be, held up on a pedestal with how awesome he is. They were going to tear him down. People from his childhood were going to tear him down. They were going to prove that he didn't pull off the perfect crime. They were going to show all the mistakes that he actually made. And I really just don't think that Bryan could put himself through that. I am not surprised he took a plea deal. He probably is a coward. He did not want to be put to death. The firing squad in Idaho, that sounds absolutely terrifying. I personally think that he did deserve that result. I respect the parents who feel like they didn't get the justice. I do think the prosecution, they probably didn't want to spend the money. I feel like they wimped out. They didn't give the justice that these kids really, truly deserved. I would have supported that happening. But on the flip side of that, there are so many things that could have happened that could have screwed this up, and he could have walked. So, in the end, laws could have changed. He may not have ever faced the death penalty. It might not have actually been executed on him. So either way, he's off the streets. I do think that once he felt really alive after committing this crime, I really do think he was going to do it again. I think he emulated Ted Bundy, Elliot Rodgers to an extent. They weren't exactly alike, but Elliot Rodgers went after sorority women and unalived them. But I think he probably would have liked to have been that charming, charismatic guy like Ted Bundy and doing it over and over again. I really feel like if he's had that first real feeling of being proud of knowing what it felt like to commit those crimes, he probably was going to do it again. He was probably gearing up to just keep going. And so thank God, technology, cameras, license plate readers. I mean, it's very difficult to commit crimes in this day and age with the technology. It's going to get even harder and harder as DNA technology advances. But, some of the things that intrigued me again were the fact that I really do feel like his family is like, thank God he is away. We don't have to deal with him terrorizing us anymore. They may be concerned that if he's in jail that he could get unalived, like who was the guy that killed all those people? He got killed in jail. I'm drawing a blank right now, but they may be concerned for his safety in jail, but ultimately he's not their responsibility anymore. He's in a cell, he is being protected, and they may be breathing a sigh of relief that they don't have to deal with him anymore, their own blood. And again, some of the things that I wanted to share tonight were the fact that I don't think that he could have taken sitting through a trial where it would be shown that he wasn't brilliant and that he didn't do the best crime and that he made mistakes. And I don't think he would have wanted to be brought down in his own mind like that. So very difficult situation. But if you have not already checked out, go to Amazon Prime. I just watched it today, the series that they have. And I really like this documentary by Amazon Prime because it really focuses on the victims. We get to see some of the people who were involved that day. Hunter, I had never seen him before. These were the kids that actually went into the house and called 911 and were there for each other. Really focuses on the four people that we should be focusing on: Maddie Mogan, Kaylee Gonsalves, Ethan Chapin, and Xana Kernodle. Those are the people that are really important here. And even though I wanted to take a deep dive into, what it was like parenting somebody like Bryan Kohberger, that really is what I wanted to end on is these victims and their families who have been through so much. And I just hope that they all are at peace now. And hopefully after the sentencing next week, we can all just move on and do things that will be good for those 4 kids. So anyway, again, thank you if you've hung out with me all night. Again, thank you for being a Crime Crunchy. Just a reminder to please subscribe, like, comment, and share. And let me know if there's any other information you would like me to share with you. And I'm looking forward to it. Again, this is your host, Courtney C. And thanks for being a Crunchy.